Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Evidence-Based Decision-Making and the Feedback Loop. We are so glad that you're able to be here today. The Maryland State Department of Education Formative Assessment Team consists of 4 specialists. My name is Kyla Dunn. Denise Stringer is our project manager. Melissa Finkel and Arlisa Ledbetter run out our group. We have given you a brief description of our area of expertise. Our contact information will be provided at the end of today's webinar. I would now like to introduce Julia Payne-Lewis. She is a formative assessment expert with Measured Progress. She will facilitate today's webinar, and I will be back at the end to answer any questions. Julia?
Hi. I'm so glad that everyone's here and that you're joining us today. And I will let you read a little bit about me, but mostly I just want to get going. We've got lots to talk about today. So before we dive into the content for today, I just want to let people know that our next webinar in March will be focusing on ways to support and sustain the use of the formative materials that Maryland teachers will have continued access to. And I will be sharing some training tools that we've developed and that we're developing, and hopefully we will also get some great ideas from you and your colleagues about the best ways to keep the momentum going, because we want to see this last for a long time. So today we're going to be focusing on what to do with evidence once it's been collected. So what next? And this is often a question that I get from teachers that I work with. And this may be a question that you have too. I hope that during this entire webinar that you will feel free to share with us the things that you know and things that you do to support this, because every time I do a webinar with Maryland educators, I always hear new ideas and gain insight into what actually works in classrooms on a practical level. So I hope that that will be part of today as well. So we're going to focus on the next steps in the formative process once we've gathered information from evidence and collected all of the evidence. So the session targets are listed above, and take a minute to read through these. And not just read through them, but think about how they relate to your current understanding of how you might use items as formative tools. And that's been the focus of this whole series. And we're going to address these targets as we move through. So speaking of tools, I chose some handouts for today's session that we won't necessarily be talking about directly, but I thought you might find them helpful as you think about the formative use of feedback. One of the things that I've been given a lot of feedback for the webinars is, people like the tools and the templates to try out and modify, of course, in your own classrooms and how you might use them. And I'm always interested in hearing about the tools that you use as well. So for those of you who have been part of previous webinars in this series, you know we're going to dive into the content by beginning with an activation of prior knowledge activity. And we know that this formative strategy helps students think about their current understanding, and it allows teachers to evaluate where students are within a progression of learning. So that's the purpose of the activation of prior knowledge. So for this activation of prior knowledge, we're going to look at these questions. They're focused on a teacher's informational needs. So answering these kind of questions is critical for good instruction. It's not easy, but in the chat box, you can put a number or even more than one number in the chat box. If you feel comfortable, you can share your rationale for your choices as well. We'd love to hear what you think about these questions. Which of these really stand out for you? Which one do you ask yourself the most often, or which two do you ask yourself the most often about your students as you're going through your curriculum? And also I wanted to remind people, your sharing is a great way to learn from one another. So be sure to choose everyone when you send a message in the chat box. Oh, I noticed that Kyla said that as well. Because really and truly, this is a professional learning community of sorts. So 4 and 6. I was wondering if a lot of people were going to pick 6 today, because I hear about that one a lot from teachers too. Not only how should I group students, but what are the best ways to do that, which is interesting. So we'll give people a couple minutes to respond. Remember, share to everyone so we can all see. So we have, well, just about everyone's been chosen so far. A lot of ones. I think I was often asking who is and who is not getting the lesson or understanding the lesson during my teaching. Kind of looking around, trying to say to myself, where do I need to go in the room at this moment? So if you want to take a little time to, even if we move on to the next slide, when we do a chat box activity, it's okay to add things to it, you know, at all times, go right ahead. And if there's anything you want to add in terms of why that might be, you're welcome to take a minute and do that as well. So we'll move on, but please feel free to keep adding, because I'm going to be looking over at the chat box even if I like Anne's. All are important. They are. They're definitely important. What's interesting is that teachers ask so many questions throughout the year. It's just amazing. And the next slide, the soup analogy, I love this slide, partly because I just really like soup and arugula, which I think is what's on the soup. But I love this because it's so true about our students. You know, when we're working with them, you know, as educators and trying to, you know, help students learn through the progression of learning and to get them ready to really move on. So this quote is from Robert Stake, and I think it goes well with the activation of prior knowledge activity questions. As these questions are being answered, learning is being formed. Throughout the year, students are learning and teachers and students are assessing progress together. Instructional decisions are being made, so that when the high-stakes summative assessment comes along, the hope is that the students will be ready and that the student learning objectives for that year have been met for each of the students. And that's when the guests get to taste the soup. They get to see all the data that comes from it. So, impacts. I think it's amazing the impact that analyzing student evidence can have. And this slide goes back to what we know about the impact of formative assessment in general, how high an impact it has. And as we shift our thinking from correcting in this webinar to informing, it also impacts when and where students are given summative grades. And I hate to bring up the topic of grades, because sometimes it's like opening a can of worms. I don't know if it's like that for you where you're in your district and in your school, but I've heard a lot of teachers say that it's a conundrum about whether or not to, you know, truly call something formative and not give it a grade, or whether it's really important to give a grade for that. And will students still do the work, and will parents still be happy if everything isn't graded? And I'd love to hear your feedback about that. But as we begin to dive into the content of descriptive feedback, it's important to remember that feedback and grading are really based in two different concepts: assessment of learning and assessment for learning. So in this slide, we're talking some more about that analysis piece, and that analysis really is about leading to the kinds of differentiation and closing learning gaps. And it happens during an instructional time when teaching and learning is impacted immediately, right in the moment, and also through reflection after a lesson has taken place. So you might even be thinking about it as you look at exit slips, or as you reflect back on the lesson, because it's going to be impacting what happens tomorrow. Or for sometimes, I know it when I was in the middle school level, sometimes a lesson that I had with one group and the feedback that I got and that I gave during that lesson, even though it was maybe a few minutes later between grades, between classes coming in, I might even make some adjustments to instruction, within the 5 minutes between classes. So when students are engaged in learning, they use the lesson objectives, the learning targets, rubrics, and any success criteria that they've been provided with to keep track of how well they're moving forward towards a goal. And the clearer and more fine-tuned the criteria, the easier it is for both the students and teachers to interpret the evidence that's been collected. And the evidence collected might come through conversations, through observations, and written examples that you collect. But I like to talk about, all of the evidence I collect, even in talking to the students as I'm, walking around the room or in a group conversation. And some of the things that we talk about, and I know that this has happened, in a few of the different webinars, that some of the things we've talked about are time consuming. It can take time to really look for the gaps. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. We talked about using tools like warm-up activities and the use of questioning during a lesson. And while it takes more time to use these tools thoughtfully, they can really save time in the end. Especially uncovering misconceptions. It can be a really good thing. And I've had some experience with this myself where I've left a lesson and been really frustrated because it seems like the kids just aren't getting it. I don't know if anybody else here has had that happen, but I would try to turn that around and ask myself, instead of like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this, none of them seem to be understanding the concept. Instead, I would say, okay, how am I going to use this information? And I don't know if any of you have had that experience, but remember that the purpose of formative assessment is to close the gap between students' current status and the intended learning goal. So students who are learning something new should have a gap. Otherwise, they won't be moving forward in their learning. And sometimes I would need to remind myself, okay, they're not getting it, but that's because this is new, and we're going to take it slowly, and we're going to go through the progression of learning and figure out where kids are and move from there. I've also seen it happen where, definitely seen it happen where teachers are like, oh, I guess we don't need to do as many lessons on this as I thought. So taking the time also to check in with kids can help with knowing where you have to start within the content. So the first bullet on this slide is my favorite. We often look at student work scores from summative assessments, and we try to use that information to change instruction. I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but I've seen whole buildings focusing on an aspect of the large-scale assessment that students showed a weakness in from the previous year. Like in one school, it's all about informational text features this year. And we're all going to focus on that because that was a weakness in the test scores from last year. But tracking a weak area over time can be really useful. But checking in with teachers about areas of concern with current students would probably yield better results because teachers really are the keepers of where students are in their understanding and where they are within the standards. So I think that's really important, to look beyond just the data. And so the experts, in this case, 3 really big experts in the area of formative assessment talk about how much feedback. You know, that's not the critical piece. It's really about quality versus quantity, and that can be a relief to people. I think it's important to remember as we move into talking about feedback that it's easy to become overwhelmed with the amount of feedback that we might potentially want to give our kids. The focus should be on quality, not quantity, because if we had to write out extensive feedback on every student's paper, that's all we would be doing. We would have absolutely no life outside of school. So honing in on providing feedback directly related to the criteria is important, the goals, the targets of the lesson, and that can help keep the feedback manageable. One of the biggest advantages in formulating feedback, you know, thinking about it not just as a way to provide it to the kids, but it has another purpose, which is huge. Whether it's during a discussion or on a sticky note or even to the whole class, the feedback that you have to come up with to provide to students sort of reflexively shapes the instructional decisions in the moment. So without even sitting and analyzing stacks of papers or test scores and planning elaborate grouping arrangements, thinking through the type of feedback that you would want to give to students will have a strong impact on what you do next for that student and for the whole class. Just the act of thinking, what feedback would I give, can have a really big impact on what you do. So besides just giving the student feedback, it's also almost giving feedback to you. So the practice of providing descriptive feedback in itself is the best way to support student growth. And that's very much based in the research. The feedback, when you look at all of the formative assessment feedback that's out, research that's out there, the feedback is the best, you know, bang for your buck in terms of like how much you're going to get out of it and how much the kids are going to get out of it. So now that we've sort of talked about the importance and what the experts say, we're going to go back to the chat box. And the first thing I want you to do, and this is not for the chat box, this is just to keep in your own mind. So the very first thing I want you to do right now is to think about and reflect on the last instructional feedback that you gave to a student in your classroom. If you're an administrator or you work in a different position, think about the feedback you gave to someone that you're supervising or that works with you or for you. And just keep that feedback in your mind. So just tuck it away. What was that last feedback that you gave? It could have been like within an hour ago for some of you. But you don't have to share that. But next, I want you to write the last feedback that you were given as a teacher or as an adult. Think about the last feedback you were given and just put it in the chat box and share it with everyone so we can see what that feedback was. Hopefully it was great feedback, but it may not have been. We'll see. And for, you know, today we'll stick with the feedback that we were given most recently, maybe from a parent, a student, a principal, a coach. And don't worry about if it was descriptive or not. Just try to capture the feedback in just a few words. We'll take a minute to let people write. Think about your audience. Looks like we have a couple of trainers there from Nicole and Lynn and Jennifer. Nice. So far, really positive feedback. I like the park practice. Now I want to know what happened with the third grade practice, but that's okay. Nice. So I know that, one of the reasons why I'm asking you to think about the feedback that you received is partly because I think that we sometimes lose sight of the power of that feedback for ourselves, and sort of framing the feedback that we give. Oh, I like that one. This is a good one too. Let's see what the kids can do without support, because that might not sound like feedback, but it actually is. Yeah, that's great. Oh, thanks for helping me out with what happened with the park practice. It was those Chromebooks, I'm telling ya. So, and the tech issues are going to be with us for a little while till we figure all that out for the assessments. But I really appreciate you sharing, and I think that it helps get us in that frame of mind about the importance of feedback and how it, really impacts all of us and our learning. Yeah, and the parent feedback. Yes, the items are hard. Definitely. I've heard that from quite a few people recently, that it's just, we're getting there, but it's the, getting started with a different kind of item can be tough. And the cognitive rigor has been bumped up for sure. So we're going to go to the next slide, but feel free to keep writing. We do collect all of this, everything that's in the chat box, and that really helps us figure out kind of how to best address things next time too. So thank you. So the role of effective feedback in the classroom. This is a reminder of what we've already talked about, with the emphasis on the connection between the intended target and the feedback given, because that can really help narrow down what you want to give feedback about. So there are two forms of feedback, and both have their own purpose and place. Today we're going to be talking about the use of descriptive feedback, but I do feel like sometimes we say, we talk so much about descriptive feedback that people worry that evaluative doesn't have its place and it isn't important, but it's also important, just for different things. So I don't want anybody to think that that's not a good idea either. I do think sometimes the descriptive feedback gets more mileage, of course, during the learning process. So balancing the percentage of how much evaluative and how much descriptive feedback can be based on where kids are in their learning. So feedback differences. Evaluative feedback is really about a summative grade. Again, both kinds of feedback have their place. The research supports the use of descriptive feedback to increase learning, and evaluative feedback for summative purposes can be motivating to some students as well, and also to parents who want to know where a student's learning fits within the expected outcomes. So I think that's important to remember. And going back to the recent feedback you received, was it descriptive or evaluative? Now that you think about it, did it help you move forward in your learning, or was it more like great job? And hearing that you did a great job can help support learning too, because it means do that again. I want to see that again because that was great. And so it can help form your thinking as well. And what about the last feedback you remember giving to a student or somebody that you supervise? Was it descriptive or was it evaluative? So these are just some things to think about. Taking what I asked you to sort of, form in your mind, where would you place that for yourself? And you don't need to share that. I just want you to think about it. Oh, so somebody was saying the feedback from the parent was evaluative, definitely. Too hard. And it's interesting, too, because I think that we've evolved so much in classrooms and in education in general that we're much more cognizant of the feedback we give students, too. And we don't see as many, I don't see as many examples of, big red X on everything and a big, red F with a circle around it and an exclamation point. Because people are aware of sort of what the research has said about feedback in general. The other thing that's really interesting, I was in a school recently and the teacher was saying that she's trying not to say, great job all the time to kids because she knows that that really doesn't provide a lot of information. And so she's really working on that. It's so reflexive though. It's so quick for me to say that too when I'm working with kids. So descriptive feedback, just some constructive ways that you might offer students feedback. And I actually have had a couple of educators that have taken this slide, which you will definitely have access to, and they just print it out and keep it close when they're trying to come up with what to say to kids, when they're correcting or they're giving feedback to students, because it helps remember, oh yeah, that's what I could do in this case, and especially when you're just first starting out. Asking a question can be so powerful. It's really amazing. So they could be in written form, they could be in verbal form. And while individual student feedback is really powerful, whole group feedback can be as effective. You'd be surprised how much whole group feedback can move even one or two students forward who were thinking, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do, or that's what she meant, or that's what he meant, or that's what that feedback means. Many times students will hear their own questions or concerns when you're addressing the whole class. And I use this technique when I'm doing face-to-face trainings with adults. I walk around the room during the discussions and activities in order to gather thoughts and information, and then I feed it forward. What I've picked up on, I feed it forward to the whole group. And that can be really powerful. I call that when I put on my bat ears and I walk around and listen, listen, listen. And that's a great way to sort of observe. And I also sometimes take a few notes, just a few Post-it notes while I'm walking around as well. So I want to give you some examples of some descriptive feedback. And I hope that you can see this on your slide, on your screen in front of you. It's a little hard to read, but it says, Kristen, the criteria checked are things you did well in your response. Think about your goal thoughts. How might you make text connections to your personal experiences? So this is where you can see the criteria is very clear here. It's very much spelled out what's expected. And so it's much easier, again, to give feedback when you have some clear criteria. And it's a great way to use a rubric. This is not really a rubric. This is more of like a checklist. But just in thinking about using rubrics, if it's really well designed, you can do some marking up on a rubric that really saves time on writing. It really cuts down on the writing, but it also at the same time increases student ownership of the learning. And this other example is from an item from the item bank. And I know that I'm supposed to be making that connection all the time. And so you can see the thing that I would notice in this is look at the learning target and then look at the sticky note and see if you can make a connection between those. Because I think that that's, sometimes I might show you something and it's not like the perfect connection. But in this case, I think it's okay. It's really going right back to the target. I'm sorry about the spacing on the Post-it note, too. I didn't notice that, but it's a little odd. I like this comment, too. A verbal great job may be okay regarding the strengths in a student's response. However, offering specific suggestions and feedback to strengthen the response can help a student make that response even greater. And that's a really awesome comment in the chat box, which now, of course, listen to my verbal feedback about that, which is a perfect example of what typically happens. But the reason why I feel like that's a good thing to remember is that specific suggestions, sometimes we save those for the kids who we really know have huge gaps in their understanding. But there's probably always a way to give feedback to strengthen the response, even if it's, meets the standard. And I think that's really important to remember. The other thing is that if you tell a student, this is what I was looking for, look at how well this matches the criteria for success, it helps students know that that's the right direction to go in for the next time. And so I think that's important too. So those are some examples of descriptive feedback. And just a reminder, I talked a little bit about this before, that descriptive feedback surpasses all other strategies for moving learning forward. And this is one of those things that's been studied and studied and studied. So I feel very confident about it. And I know this from experience too, that in the second bullet, many of you may be familiar with the scenario where you spend a lot of time writing comments and grading papers that might end up stuffed in lockers or in the hall outside the classroom or perhaps in the recycling. Students might look at their grade and then they're done with the paper. And that goes back to the idea that sometimes it's, giving the grade may detract from what kids actually read, that all the time you've put into that feedback and all that you've written. Sometimes the grade on the paper at the same time can really, it becomes all-consuming. So, and it's not that I haven't seen teachers use structured ways to use the feedback that they've given for the next paper, even with a grade on it. And in that case, teachers typically collect the paper after the kids have seen it so they can file it and the kids can use it. So, just thinking about how much feedback you give and where that feedback ends up is also really important in this. And thinking about it in relationship to the grade and whether you put the grade on or not. So believe it or not, instead of providing extensive written feedback, the research supports that a better way to provide feedback might be to walk around during the time that the assignment is being worked on by the students and providing the feedback verbally or on a sticky note, just a small amount. And that's not always possible because sometimes you have to go into a lot more depth. But when that is possible, that's a very effective tool. So extensive comments might not be helpful if you're also providing a grade, and using the time that kids are working on the project to give feedback can be very powerful and may even be more powerful than the feedback that is written on a paper. Sometimes for English classes and other, for projects where kids are doing extensive writing, that might not work to just walk around. Sometimes you sometimes have to give some written feedback to students. So that's something to remember too. There's a lot of research which is interesting about how kids experience grades and feedback when they're both on the same paper. And I don't know if any of you have heard about any of this research, but so even from like grades 2 through undergraduates in college, they've studied like what happens. So, typically if there's a grade and comments, students look at the grade first, and then sometimes they look at the comments, but they usually look at the grade first. And sometimes they may be interested in what they did well or got wrong, but moving forward in their learning may not factor in, according to the research. So, I'm really wondering what you're all thinking right now. Oh, I want to see some more of the comments too in the chat box. Oh, this is a good one too, the time management. of real-time feedback and instructional loop with the emphasis on small group work in math and reading becomes a huge challenge. Yes, absolutely, especially in those classes with almost 30 students. And that's really a challenge. So, you know, there isn't an easy answer to it, but sort of deciding what kind of feedback you're going to give, sort of even planning it in advance of how you're going to do it, and again, using every opportunity, even if it's a small sticky note with just a couple of words on it, something to think about. But I definitely understand the time management issue. If only we could add some kind of extra time in the 24 hours we have. Life would be so much easier. So I want to just go back to the student learning objectives for a minute, though. And I think that they actually are a great way to frame feedback as well. It's a good way to think about the feedback you're providing. So at the same time you're working day to day and minute by minute, another piece to this is keeping the end goal in mind. So as learning and teaching are broken out into sort of manageable chunks, whether it's lessons or units or you know, however you have things lined up for your curriculum, the feedback given along the way will get students closer and closer to mastering the student learning objectives. So, oh, that's a good question. In our discussion about feedback, how will this be used for next week's tasks? I understand. So actually, you'll be providing feedback about tasks to measured progress. And I hope that you will have some great descriptive feedback, because that will be great. I'm so glad that there are people that are on this webinar that will also be at the sessions where you'll be giving feedback, because you can support the concept of descriptive feedback to make sure the goals are very clear about how what you're expected to do too. So this next slide, it's important because this can be an intense topic for people. The whole feedback thing, sometimes it can cause some stress. So I thought it'd be good to give Calvin's perspective on assessment for learning versus assessment of learning. I found this to be a great cartoon to use for training when I'm working with teachers too. So please feel free to use it if you're in that situation where you might need some levity about the topic of descriptive feedback and grading. So now I want to take some time to have you, again, spend some time having some chat box discussion about a couple of the items that we looked at during the last webinar. So in choosing the student work samples for today, I specifically chose examples that were a little trickier to provide feedback for. They're not incorrect, but both students have room to move forward and take next steps in their learning. And sometimes this can be the hardest kind of work to provide feedback for. So feedback in these cases can have a big impact on closing gaps that can mean the difference between meeting the standard or just getting close. And so I want you to take a look at this student work. And it's clear that they could answer the question using the graphic. But what can you learn about this student's progression in understanding equivalent fractions? And where would you want them to move forward as they continue with their understanding of equivalent fractions? So what descriptive feedback would you give this student? And if you wouldn't mind sharing with us your thoughts in the chat box, it's a great way, again, to learn from each other and give you some practice. You can ask the student a question. You might think about where's the end goal for the student with equivalent fractions. And remember, this was a 4th grader. And the other thing to remember too is this one's math, but the next one will be English language arts too. So if this is not your area as much as the next one, you can think about it. Oh, that's some great feedback. You use such specific language to identify what half meant when someone has 6 items. Oh, this is interesting. The student understands that 3/6 is the same as a half, but doesn't clarify that 6 are all of equal size. So what might you say to that student? And it doesn't have to be Jennifer that answers this. What would you say to the student to help them start making that connection maybe? Oh, how do you know that you drew a line where half is? Could you use another fraction strip to help? So that one, Smitha said, you know, kind of the question that you might ask based on what Jennifer noticed was the issue. So you kind of work together there. Thank you. Unknowingly collaborating in the chat box. Very nice. But yeah, that's a great, I think that definitely that's something that I might say to a student in this case. I learn a lot from all of you in these webinars, by the way. Thank you. Awesome. And if you want to add to the chat box, please feel free. But we're gonna go on to English language arts. So that item was the warm-up that we used in the last webinar for the math. And then this item that we're going to look at next was we used it as an example of an exit slip for middle school ELA. And what's interesting, this item was originally an evidence-based selected response item, which has 2 parts to it. But in this case, you know, and what they do in that one is they answer the first part of the question, and then they choose the evidence that supports their answer from 4 choices. So it's another selected response that they get to pick the evidence from. But in this case, because the students completed this problem as an exit slip, the teacher gave the students the first part and took the bottom part of the evidence-based selected response off and had them complete the second part as a short answer response rather than a multiple choice item, which then gives you a little bit more information about what's going on for that student in their thinking. So read the student response and think about what feedback would you provide to this student to help move their learning forward. And if you feel comfortable sharing an idea, please do so. There may be several ways to provide feedback to this student. So please share in the chat box what you think about this. And it may be hard to answer this, to know exactly what to say to this student because you haven't read the text, but it's actually, some of you may have read it because it's Heart and Hands, which is a common text that's been around for a while. I think what's hard about this one for me is that both responses could be correct, but I really want the student to choose one possible answer from the text because they may not have the opportunity in assessment down the road to be able to choose 2. So, you know, how do I help them figure out which response is the better one maybe, or how do you pick from 2? So I don't know what your thoughts might be, but I'm interested in hearing. The other part too is, why do you think the quotation you picked supports your answer? Oh, nice, Valerie. You use the word embarrassed. How does one quote more than the other support your thinking? That's excellent. And I know that that's not descriptive feedback, but the thing that I like about it, to give some descriptive feedback, is that you asked a question, and I think that sometimes that's the best way to get students to think. And also you picked up on that word embarrassed. And that's probably, like, that may be the rationale for the student. And so that it's a great way to sort of narrow it down into one quote or the other. And I noticed too that two of the responses that we got for both the math and the ELA, asking the student a question seems to be a really great way to provide feedback. And it's not necessarily the first thing that I would think of when I was a classroom teacher, asking a question to prompt further thinking. But it really does, that metacognition piece comes into it, and it helps students think, you know, they're almost like assessing themselves when you ask the question and bringing that metacognition piece in, thinking about their own thinking. Nice. So we're going to watch a video. And just in case this is helpful for people, we wanted to let you know that this video is on YouTube, and you can watch it by clicking on the link. If for some reason you're not able to see it during, you know, because we'll show it on the screen during the webinar, but we've had some people that have had a harder time connecting to they can't hear it or something with the video, so this is another way to get at the video. It's about 2 minutes. It's not very long. It's about 1 minute and 54 seconds. And we'll watch it. And if you need to see it offline or at another time, that's fine. So. We have to switch over with some technical stuff, so I had to pause there. So I wanted to, if you had to guess, how many times did Alice refer back to the criteria for success that she had outlined for the students? What would your guess be? And you can put the number in the chat box if you think you can. I haven't actually counted, but I just am curious about what you think. And why is this so important? This is just a question to think about. I wanted to also tell you, besides pointing out the number of times she might have gone back to the criteria, that later on, the student that got the red sticker, one of the things that was really nice about it, about the way Alice uses the traffic lighting in her classroom, is that once students can correct their, like she said, I am not seeing this, that student could go back and, make the correction that is needed, and then they can get a different color traffic light sticker right on top of the red one. So very likely by the end of the lesson, that student would have the red sticker covered up with either a yellow if they were getting closer, or a green if they were able to fix their error, which is really nice. So that, they may leave class and start with a red, and then there's like a little stack of stickers on top of the dots to give them the opportunity for revision. So it's definitely formative. It has nothing to do with any final grade or anything like that. They have every opportunity to go ahead and correct any errors that they're making. And in that particular classroom, the kids really did. They would go back and correct things. So I noticed people were saying 5 or 6 or multiple, definitely multiple times. And I think that that's one of the things that, can be hard to remember, but it's definitely, it's powerful in terms of kids all knowing kind of where they stand within that progression of learning. So I have to say this is some of my most favorite content to talk about, and I can't believe that it's been 50 minutes because it feels like it's flown right by. I want to leave you with some closing thoughts, and I think that, again, just a reminder that formative feedback is such a powerful tool. We know it from our own experiences as students, as teachers, as adult learners, and it's so critical. So I want to leave you with these words from Roy Sadler and say thank you so much for being here today. All of the materials will be available to you, including PowerPoint slides and the links and all of those things. And I hope you get a chance to look at the materials that are also posted for you to use. There's a nice article in there, or it's actually an excerpt from a book, and a couple of templates that I thought you might find helpful. So take a look at those and see if there's anything you can use or pass on to others. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kyla.
Thank you, Julia. As I mentioned at the beginning, our contact information is being displayed now. So if you would like to speak directly to one of the MSPE formative assessment specialists, please feel free to contact us. Email is the best way. We have some time remaining in today's webinar, so please feel free to ask any questions that you may have in the chat box, and Julia and I will answer those. While you are doing that, let me give you a few notes. As Julia mentioned, today's webinar was recorded and will be posted on our blog within a week. I will send you that email with the link to it. Our next webinar, as seen on the screen right now, is March 11th at 4 p.m. You will also receive another email from me with that link for registration in the coming weeks. And finally, a third email will come from me with a survey. It's about 5 questions, and it just helps us to prepare the webinars, the type of webinars that are most beneficial to you. So if you would please take just a few minutes and fill that out, it really does help Julia and myself to prepare these webinars really to benefit you and what information you need to learn. So you'll be receiving that from me either tomorrow or Friday. Again, we have about 5 minutes, so if there's any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box and we will respond to them. Thank you.
I liked the comment about the colored stickies are a great way to give immediate feedback, and it's interesting because in that particular class, they didn't know what to do with all the blue stickies. And so the students actually came up with, well, what if we used it for like exceeding the standard? And so, because they had all these leftover blue stickies all the time. So I thought that was really interesting that they came up with that together. Nice, yeah. And EdCamp is the one, is that the one where you get to choose the topics that you present?
Yes. Valerie, were you part of the MSD EdCamp this past weekend? We had one at MSDE. I don't know. Yes, it was fabulous.
Yeah, awesome.
I agree. I don't know when the State Department will do another one. I hope that they do continue formative assessment. As you are, you may or may not be aware, my group is part of Race to the Top, so our time with the State Department is coming to a close. We actually will end our contracts on June 30th, so I really do hope that the educators of Maryland and central office staff take all of the information that we have given you over the past few years and disseminate it out to your schools and keep the message alive after we are gone. Proof of attendance. Yes, I have done that. If you will email me tomorrow, my email address is being displayed right now on the screen. If you email me, I can send you a response email that states that you did participate in today's webinar. I'm happy to do that. You're welcome. And again, we have about 2 more minutes. If there's any additional questions for Julia, you can always get in touch with me through my email address. If you think of any questions later on that you forgot to ask during today's webinar.
Absolutely, and it's been really wonderful to spend time with this group today. Very informative for me as well.
Okay, well, it looks like we have come to the end of our webinar. Thank you again, everyone, for participating and coming out. Thank you, Julia. This was a great kind of introduction to feedback and formative assessment, and I hope that everyone who participated today can take something back and has some information to start digging deeper into feedback and formative assessment and utilizing that in your classroom. Please look out for the survey and the link and the registration for the March webinar, and I hope to see you all again either at the review sessions coming up in the next few weeks or on March 11th at 4 o'clock. Have a fantastic evening, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.